The morning began the way every morning began at the federal courthouse downtown, with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the marble corridors and the soft click of polished shoes against stone floors. Outside, the city had only just begun to wake, delivery trucks idling along the curb, commuters hurrying past the wide stone steps without sparing the building a second glance, unaware that within a few hours its hallways would be carrying a story that would travel far beyond the four walls of any single courtroom. Lawyers in tailored suits moved in clusters, trading gossip and laughter, their voices echoing off the high ceilings of the building that had seen decades of verdicts handed down and lives changed forever. The kind of institutional grandeur designed to remind every visitor that what happened inside these walls mattered, that the decisions rendered here carried weight long after the people who made them had gone home for the evening. Among them stood Richard Calloway, a defense attorney whose name appeared in legal journals more often than most judges did, a man who carried himself like he owned the very air inside the room. His shoes polished to a mirror shine, his suit cut with the precision of someone who understood that appearance in certain circles mattered nearly as much as argument. Beside him walked Diane Foster, his longtime colleague, nodding along to whatever he said, laughing at jokes that were not particularly funny, but that she laughed at anyway because that was simply how things worked around Richard. A dynamic the two of them had settled into years earlier and never once questioned. He had a way of making every courtroom feel like his personal stage, and on this particular morning, before the session even began, he was already telling a younger associate that there was not a judge in this building he could not read within the first 5 minutes of a hearing. That experience had taught him exactly how to tilt a room in his favor before opposing counsel had even opened their files. Diane chuckled and agreed because she always agreed, and the two of them strolled toward courtroom 4 with the easy confidence of people who had never once doubted their place in the world. Their footsteps unhurried, their conversation light, utterly unaware that the next several hours would dismantle every assumption either of them carried into that room. It was at that exact moment that a woman walked through the heavy wooden doors dressed in a vest that had clearly seen better years. Her hair pulled back simply, her expression calm and unreadable. She carried no briefcase, no stack of files balanced precariously against her hip, only a single worn folder tucked beneath her arm. And there was nothing about her entrance that suggested she expected to be noticed at all. She moved without hurry, without the performative swagger so many lawyers wore like cologne. And she took a seat near the front, near the area typically reserved for counsel, choosing the chair closest to the aisle as though she had sat in that exact spot 100 times before and felt no particular need to draw attention to herself. She opened her folder, scanned through some papers, and said nothing to anyone. Her eyes moving steadily across the page in front of her, occasionally pausing to make a small note in the margin with a pen she produced from an inside pocket. Richard glanced at her once, then again. And something about her presence irritated him in a way he could not quite explain, perhaps because she did not fit the picture he had already painted of who belonged in this room and who did not. Perhaps because her composure unsettled him in a manner he was not accustomed to encountering from strangers. He leaned toward Diane and murmured something about family members of defendants always trying to sit in the wrong section, and Diane gave a small laugh in response. The two of them exchanging a glance that suggested they had already decided, without a single word from the woman herself, exactly who she was and what she was worth. Nobody in the gallery paid much attention because nobody yet understood that this quiet woman in the worn vest was about to upend everything they thought they knew about that morning. That within the span of a single hour, the entire balance of power inside that courtroom would shift in a direction none of them could have predicted. Richard, never one to let an assumption go unspoken, walked directly toward her chair, his shadow falling over the folder she was reading. He told her in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by even speaking to her that she needed to stand and find a seat in the back because this area was reserved for attorneys. The woman looked up at him, her eyes steady, and replied simply that she was waiting for her hearing to begin. Richard scoffed, the corner of his mouth curling into something close to a smirk, and said that everyone in the building was waiting for something, as if her explanation meant nothing at all. Without waiting for a further response, he reached down and swept the folder off the seat beside her. The papers sliding loudly onto the floor, and in the same motion his hand struck her shoulder hard enough that she had to catch herself against the armrest to keep from losing her balance. A few heads turned in the gallery. A young court reporter froze mid-step, but nobody said a word because nobody wanted to be the one to challenge Richard Calloway in his own territory. And the silence that followed was the kind that makes a room feel smaller than it actually is. Marcus Hale, the bailiff stationed near the side wall, had seen plenty of friction unfold in this courthouse over the years. Impatient attorneys snapping at clerks, frustrated visitors raising their voices when a hearing ran late, and his instinct in that moment was to treat this as nothing more than another instance of the same tired pattern. He noted the commotion, registered the raised voice, and made a mental decision that intervention was unnecessary, that the woman would either find another seat or quietly accept Richard's correction, the way most people did when confronted by someone speaking with that particular blend of authority and condescension. He did not yet understand that his hesitation, like the silence of everyone else in that gallery, would later feel like a small failure when measured against what the morning would ultimately reveal. For now, he simply turned his attention back toward the door, watching for the next group of attorneys due to arrive, unaware that the woman he had just dismissed from his concern was about to become the most important person in that entire building. What struck the few onlookers who did notice was not the woman's reaction, but her lack of one. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand an apology. She simply knelt down, gathered her scattered papers one by one, straightened them against her knee, and placed them back into the folder with the same unhurried calm she had carried since she first walked through those doors. Richard, emboldened by her silence, took it as confirmation of everything he already believed about her, and he turned to the small audience that had gathered to watch the morning's proceedings and announced, loud enough for several rows to hear, that this courtroom was reserved for people with proper credentials, for people who understood the rules of the institution. A ripple of laughter moved through a cluster of junior associates standing near the wall, the kind of laughter that comes from wanting to be on the winning side of a joke rather than truly finding it funny. One reporter, sensing something worth capturing, quietly lifted her phone and began recording, though she could not have said exactly why she felt the pull to do so. The court bailiff, a heavy-set man named Marcus Hale, glanced over at the commotion, but it was nothing more than an ordinary disagreement, the kind he had seen unfold 100 times before between impatient lawyers and confused visitors. He returned his attention to his clipboard, missing the full weight of what had just happened. The woman, meanwhile, simply rose, smoothed her vest, and resumed her seat as though the incident had cost her nothing at all. For the gallery, the strangeness of her composure became its own kind of mystery. A retired school teacher seated 2 rows back leaned toward her husband and whispered that she had never seen anyone absorb such public humiliation without so much as a flicker of anger crossing their face. Diane, still standing beside Richard, found herself studying the woman more closely now, an uneasy feeling beginning to take root somewhere beneath her practiced smile, though she could not yet name what was bothering her. Richard, riding the high of his own performance, continued holding court among his small audience, recounting a case he had won the previous month, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that filled every corner of the room. He believed, as he always did, that he had already won this morning before a single official proceeding had even begun, that the quiet woman in the back had been put properly in her place and would cause no further disruption to his day. He could not have known how wrong that assumption would prove to be within the span of a few short minutes. The murmurs in the gallery had not yet died down when the heavy doors at the rear of the chamber creaked open and a different kind of stillness settled over the room, the kind that precedes something official. The bailiff straightened his posture, the court reporter set down her tablet and folded her hands. Richard, still mid-sentence with one of his colleagues, barely registered the shift in atmosphere, too absorbed in his own anecdote to notice that the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Diane, however, felt it immediately, a prickly awareness that something was about to happen that would matter far more than the small drama of the folder and the shoulder and the laughter that had followed it. She glanced toward the front of the room, toward the raised platform where the judge's chair sat empty, polished wood gleaming under the overhead lights, waiting. The clerk's voice rang out clear and formal, instructing everyone in the chamber to rise, and the shuffle of bodies standing in unison filled the room with a brief wave of sound before settling into silence again. Richard rose along with everyone else, still wearing the faint, satisfied smile of a man who believed his morning had gone exactly as planned. He did not even look toward the side door through which the presiding judge would enter. His attention, instead, drifting toward Diane, ready to share one more remark about the woman they had dismissed only minutes earlier. It was in that small window of distraction that the side door opened, and the very same woman in the worn vest stepped through it, moving with the unhurried grace she had carried since the moment she first walked into the gallery. Except now, she was no longer heading toward a seat near the front. She was walking toward the bench. A black robe settled over her shoulders as she crossed the final few steps, the fabric falling into place as though it had always belonged there, as though the vest underneath had simply been a temporary disguise waiting to be shed. The clerk's voice rose again, announcing the arrival of the Honorable Judge Amara Brooks. And the words landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward until they reached every single person who had witnessed what happened only minutes before. Richard's smile did not fade gradually. It collapsed all at once, the color draining from his face as the full weight of recognition crashed over him, the realization arriving far too late to undo what he had already done. Diane's hand rose involuntarily to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, her mind racing backward through every word Richard had spoken, every laugh she had offered in agreement, every moment she could have intervened and chose instead to stay silent. The young court reporter who had quietly filmed the earlier exchange lowered her phone. Slightly, her thumb still pressed against the record button. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to satisfaction. Around the gallery, the same pattern repeated itself in face after face. Confusion giving way to astonishment, astonishment giving way to a kind of breathless anticipation. Because everyone in that room now understood that the woman who had been shoved out of her seat, mocked in front of strangers, and dismissed as someone who did not belong, was about to preside over the very proceedings in which Richard Calloway was scheduled to argue his case. Judge Brooks settled into her chair behind the bench, arranged a small stack of papers in front of her with the same calm precision she had shown while gathering her folder off the floor earlier that morning, and lifted her eyes to survey the courtroom before her. Her gaze passing briefly, deliberately, over Richard before moving on to address the room as a whole. The silence that followed was not the awkward silence of confusion, but something heavier. The silence of people realizing they had just watched a story begin that they desperately wanted to see finished. Richard attempted to recover his composure the moment the formal proceedings opened, clearing his throat and offering a brief, mumbled apology in the general direction of the bench. The kind of half-hearted gesture meant more to save face than to express genuine remorse. Judge Brooks looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before responding simply that the court was ready to proceed, with no further mention of incident from earlier that morning. To Richard, this felt like a reprieve, a sign that the matter had been quietly set aside, that professionalism would prevail, and the case would move forward as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. He straightened his tie, exchanged a relieved glance with Diane, and began organizing his notes with the renewed confidence of a man who believed he had narrowly escaped consequence. What he failed to understand in that moment of false relief was that Judge Brooks was not a woman who forgot, nor one who needed to raise her voice to make her presence felt. She was,